China is on the attack, blaming all its problems on the U.S. But how far will the Chinese Communist Party go? Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Before we start, I have an important announcement. I have to issue a correction. On the show, I've repeatedly talked about how the Chinese Communist Party has spent the last 70-plus years brutalizing the Chinese people and undermining the national security of just about every other country on the planet. Turns out I was wrong. Turns out, actually, everything is America's fault. I found out my error thanks to a recent speech by Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping, where he made it all clear. All of China's problems are America's fault. Now, for the most part, Xi has kept his public speeches a little more measured and vague when talking about the U.S. Certain countries are doing this. Some countries have a Cold War mentality. One North American country with a red, white, and blue flag is a fugly hegemony. I know, I can't believe they threw so much vague shade at Cuba. But at a recent meeting in Beijing, Xi Jinping got a lot more aggressive. He said Western countries, led by the U.S., have implemented all-round containment, encirclement, and suppression against us, bringing unprecedentedly severe challenges to our country's development. Notice he used the word containment. That's big Cold War era rhetoric right there. Containment was used during the Cold War to stop the spread of communism. So at the speech, a lot of officials from the state-backed national chambers of commerce were there. You see, the Chinese economy is kind of struggling right now because of America. The Chinese economy would be doing so much better if the U.S. hadn't pushed sanctions on China just because of some piddly little genocide. How mean of the U.S. Or the fact that Xi Jinping had to implement a zero-COVID policy that shut down big parts of the Chinese economy. Totally America's fault. After all, as China keeps saying, COVID totally came from a U.S. military base. So it came from a U.S. military base, traveled halfway across the world, and landed in Wuhan without infecting anyone else along the way, just to make China look bad. And if only the U.S. wouldn't make such a big deal out of all the theft of American intellectual property. Sure, it costs the U.S. between $225 billion and $600 billion each year, but it makes China money. I wonder if it's racism that makes the U.S. want to hold China back so much. Because anytime you're mad that someone is robbing you, it's definitely racism. You're mad I took your wallet? What a bigot. But seriously, in his speech, Xi Jinping reassured the private sector that the Communist Party would protect them from America. Xi said the Communist Party has always regarded private enterprise and private entrepreneurs as our own people and would provide them with support whenever they run into difficulties. Yeah, like how the CCP totally backed off the massive government-led crackdown on the tech sector after it really started to hurt the economy. And how the real estate market is totally not in a crisis. The Communist Party just pumped more debt into the system to keep the bubble inflated. And that bubble will never burst because you can trust the Communist Party. And if the bubble does burst, it's America's fault. Speaking of bubbles that did burst, why is the U.S. hyping up that totally civilian spy balloon to attack and smear China? You didn't see China get so angry when COVID obviously came from the U.S., didn't infect anyone else along the way, and landed in Wuhan just to make China look bad. Anyway, I'm sure at this point in the speech, all the officials from the economic sector were feeling very reassured that the Communist Party would protect them from America. Especially when Xi told them in his speech to bear in mind his push for common prosperity, aimed at redistributing more of China's wealth. Because if anything reassures the private sector, it's the promise of wealth redistribution. I just hope America doesn't somehow spin that into something that would actually hurt the Chinese economy. But it doesn't matter because, as Xi said in another speech in November, suppression and containment will only strengthen the will and boost the morale of the Chinese people. I'm pretty sure this is the only type of containment that would strengthen the will and boost the morale of the Chinese people. Because that speech was around the same time these Chinese people were saying, CCP step down, Xi Jinping step down. Sorry, those weren't the real Chinese people. Those were hostile foreign forces. Because real Chinese people would never speak ill of Xi Jinping. Probably because they're too afraid of getting tortured to death. But this new propaganda line Xi and the rest of the Communist Party is taking is actually quite dangerous. As a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council said, for Xi it's either take the blame or shift it. And how far will Xi be willing to go to shift the blame? Well, in October he said external attempts to suppress and contain China may escalate at any time. Why can't the CCP just commit genocide, spy, steal intellectual property, create a worldwide pandemic, and threaten to conquer Taiwan without other countries looking at you, America, getting all upset over it? And if you go by what China's new foreign minister, Qin Gang, also said in a speech this week, things could get messy. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. So just days after Xi Jinping took direct aim at the U.S., another fiery speech by China's new foreign minister, Qin Gang, warned that conflict and confrontation with the United States is inevitable if Washington does not change course, meaning unless the U.S. just lays back and let the Communist Party do whatever it wants. And somehow I don't think that will happen. The CCP is like an emo teen who thinks the world's out to get them without realizing that they're the problem. Also, with his haircut, Xi looks like the lead singer of My Chemical Weapons. Now, Qin Gang used to be China's ambassador to the U.S. Clearly, his time here left him with a lot of goodwill towards America. He warned of catastrophic consequences of what he described as a reckless gamble by Washington. If the United States does not hit the brakes, but continues to speed down the wrong path, no amount of guardrails can prevent derailing, and there will surely be conflict and confrontation. Why won't the U.S. just let China do whatever it wants? I bet it's because they're racist. And there were some very specific red lines that Qin was telling America not to cross, like Taiwan, which is actually not a very specific red line. What does that mean? Recognizing Taiwan as an independent country? Or selling weapons to Taiwan? The U.S. has been doing that for years. In fact, Qin Gang said, why does the U.S. talk up respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity on the Ukraine issue, but does not respect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity on the issue of Taiwan? Why does the U.S. ask China not to provide weapons to Russia while it keeps selling arms to Taiwan? Wow. Okay, well, there is a slight difference. One is an independent country at risk of being invaded by an authoritarian regime. The other is an authoritarian regime currently invading an independent country. I feel like Qin is this close to having a "are we the baddies" moment. Also, is he saying China is going to sell weapons to Russia? That's something Secretary of State Blinken warned about. And it would be a pretty big step towards World War III. Look, I know China's economy is in the toilet right now, but would Xi actually prefer World War III to having to face the consequences of his own bungled policies? You know what? I don't think I want to know the answer to that. But Qin is doubling down on Sino-Russia ties. He said, the more unstable the world becomes, the more imperative it is for China and Russia to steadily advance relations. And those relations are what's making the world so unstable. Vicious cycle. That's like saying, the more upset you are about gaining weight, the more funnel cake you need to eat. And Qin finished off with another use of Cold War containment rhetoric. Containment and suppression will not make America great. Is that a swipe at Trump? Dude hasn't been in office for years now. Forget him. Which CNN apparently did when it wrote, China has become increasingly authoritarian and Washington has pushed back under the Biden administration. I feel like they're forgetting something. That's the only thing CNN doesn't blame Trump for. Oh well. So what do you think? Are we edging closer to World War III? Or is the Chinese Communist Party just terrified the U.S. is finally pushing back? Leave your comments and a like below. And as always, this show would not exist without support from viewers like you and the crowdfunding website Patreon. They're what I call the China Uncensored 50-cent army. And as a thank you to them, I answer their questions at the end of each episode. Today's question comes from Donald St. George. At what point does China get off the milk money and not be classified as a developing country? This is just crazy. Now that's an excellent question. Yes, China is still considered a developing nation, despite being the second largest economy on the planet. That allows the Communist Party to claim a bunch of benefits that give it an unfair advantage. For example, in this recent episode, Why You Can't Compete with China, I mentioned that because of its developing nation status, the Universal Postal Union gives China lower postal rates than developed countries. That's resulted in the bizarre situation where it's cheaper to ship something from Shanghai to San Francisco than it is to ship something from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And U.S. taxpayers help subsidize that. But it's not just the Universal Postal Union. The World Trade Organization says there are special provisions which give developing countries special rights. Since the WTO gives certain advantages to developing countries, surely the WTO has a strict set of criteria to make this distinction, right? Turns out, nope. The WTO has no official definition. Members announce for themselves whether they are developed or developing countries. So basically, the Chinese Communist Party would have to decide to no longer label itself as a developing country. And since that means losing a bunch of perks that help it kill competition, I doubt that'll be happening. Which means China is a developing nation with a space station. Probably only because they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, though. I bet Burundi could make the same if they just worked harder. If that sounds ridiculous to you, that's America's fault. Thanks for your question and your support, Donald St. George. Thank you for watching. Once again, if you want to join the China Uncensored 50-cent army, head over to patreon.com/China Uncensored. All it takes is $1 per episode to help keep China Uncensored going. If you want to support the show but can't afford $1 an episode, you can also set a monthly limit. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.